Thank you, Sasha. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I will talk about this strange monster called Apionism, born in the French Parisian rather post-war context. I will present very simply the way I'm going to approach my subject, because I don't think, probably you've heard of Apionism, by the way, maybe, maybe not, probably not, because the main author, who is Audiberti, has never been translated in other languages than French. I will start with a novel, Marie Dubois, just to give you a more specific insight of his writing and the book. I think a concrete example helps for such a subject. Then we'll talk about another project that he co-edited with, he co-wrote rather with Camille Brienne, who probably is better known a little bit, another really important figure in the Parisian post-war context. And then I'll show you a little bit of paintings and drawings that are completely unpublished and are today at the archives of the IMEC in Caen. So where Audiberti's daughter put all the archives. And then I'll get a point on Brienne and Vos, probably, who you've heard of because he's much better known, probably the best known, who was associated, who was a very good friend of Brienne, and who Brienne considered like an Apionist. And so then I have to make a point, a conclusion, a reflective point on surrealism, the avant-garde, the relations with Apionism, with surrealism in post-war Paris, with the idea that this Apionism is inscribed in the history of the avant-garde and also on the reflection that was happening in Paris on the definition of the avant-garde, the role of art in the avant-garde in the world after, of course, the second important catastrophe that Audiberti and Brienne considered a real crash of Western civilization after the first. We'll talk about the first. So, Marie Dubois, to start with. So a very simple one. Will be problematized during these very simple ones that I made. So Marie Dubois, here is Marie Dubois. So Audiberti published Gallimard mostly. So he's from the south of France. He was born in Antibes and went to Paris in the early 1920s. Worked as a journalist a lot and was writing novels in the same time. Marie Dubois is the most, the best known work actually by him. It was quite sufficiently well known so that the actress Claudine Huzet took the pseudonym of Marie Dubois at one point. So here I have a picture of hers. There was not a movie on Marie Dubois, but the book was pretty famous. And also I'm showing also this film by François Truffaut that is dedicated to Audiberti, so just to show you how, in a sense, Audiberti was someone pretty much respected. He was also a cinema critic. He worked quite a lot in cinema, and you can see from this poster here that L'Homme qui aimait les femmes is dedicated to him because he really loved women. I mean, he was, and desire is there's a lot of reflection of desire as a weak point and as a kind of overwhelming point. So I don't know if you have seen L'Homme qui aimait les femmes, but at the end it's pretty fun because he kind of goes everywhere. And at the end he's all these perfusions and all that, and there's the nurse passes by, and to look at her legs, he just kind of dies because all gets disconnected. Here we go. The story of Marie Dubois, it turns around Loup Clair Collard Gaulois. I put a lot of, I'm not going to read all that. I'm just putting this if you want to take notes, or if it's phone, you can also just take the notes. I'm not going to read everything. Just as things are not so easy to find and not so famous, I prefer to put the extracts in French. I'll translate them in English, but there is no official translation of these. What do we have? So, Leclerc Colarvolo, who is a clumsy police officer, an inspector, and who at one point goes to the French suburbs and finds a couple that just committed suicide. And Marie Dubois, so a beautiful blonde woman, so here this is why Marie Dubois took that pseudo. So Marie Dubois is probably a prostitute, nobody knows what she is, so he will have his research on the case. And so he falls in love with her, so with this dead woman, and starts a journey to look for her throughout the city of Paris, to go here and there to find the place of her childhood, her house, and all that. And at the end, he finds that she's actually a lot of things in the same time. So he meets her as a child, he remembers how at one point he was traveling on the metro, and then he actually stopped the metro, but she was traveling for her exam, and so he finds a lot of themes and a lot of common points between them. And he's total frustration with his body, with his own desire, with love, with the fact that, well, he's not very successful with women and all that. At one point explodes, and through the multiple identities that he discovers with Marie Dubois, himself explodes and becomes totally immanent. And so here at the end, there is a citation here in which the energy, and also he's of course very much torn between the desire that he has for her and his kind of rather Puritan education and beliefs to stay pure. He stays pure, I mean, in his mind, because he, for instance, doesn't wash himself a lot, and this is also very insistent, so he has a body particularly clumsy and a little bit stinky. So at one point, so the desire, so he comes one with her. There's a kind of an imminence that in our liberty very often comes to the end. So the body explodes its limits. He kind of he finds a place that's isolated. He totally unleashes the energies that are within him, creates a kind of almost science fictional cap around his body, and it becomes the masters of the energies that travel. So he's connected to the world and finds in the end, through the fact that he was able to completely separate himself from his education, from culture, from all that was actually very heavy for him, explodes. And throughout his journey also, he reflects on his desire, and that's a very central topic with Aliberti. And here there is this very funny moment when he goes to the Louvre and he looks at the generals that are represented on the facade of the Louvre, and he reflects on their pants and how their sex appears. It's like, he says, like a second face, or like even the breasts of a young girl or something like this. So he kind of mixes the identities all the time and reflects on his own weakness in terms of desire. There are even some, you cannot of course talk about a feminist point here, but at one point he reflects on the fact that women become something else in the world to come. So this is written in 1937 and published after the war, but there is a reflection on those kind of changes that occur, and this the fact that actually the phallic is also a weakness, and he fully realizes that for his body. That his mind very often is completely submitted to this, and he cannot act freely. And so these topics, with the idea of multiple identities, with the idea of reflection on desire, of some kind of immanent energies that come from the body and connect to the world, and explode actually the integrity of the body and the mind, they come back in this other publication that's called L'Ouvre Boîte, Colloque of Humanists. So here the word abhumanist appears very clearly. And so the topics appear, and Marie Dubois, by the way, together with these other books that I mentioned here, Les médecins ne sont pas des plombiers, Infanticide préconisé, Recognizing Infanticide, the doctors are not plumbers, and Opéra du Monde, the world, that goes back to the fundamental religious texts and mixes them all to recreate the world, all of them. So published after the war, because some of them were written before. In Colloque Humaniste, he co-writes that with Audiberti, with Brienne. I don't have the picture here. It's not here. So they were friends, and they write this as a kind of a dialogue. A dialogue in which they reflect on the word, the war, again, desire comes a lot, frustration, how you come up to this violence. In Marie Dubois, the war is not that present, but here it is, in Louvain-la-Boîte. And so it comes from actually, the word humanist was invented by Audiberti himself when he translated this book, Benjamin Yiopoulos' book, Giusto di Michele Civa, and he translated it as Le Chevaux de Bois, so not exactly the title, and by the way, they ended up quarreling about all this translation and who did what, so at the end, both claimed to be humanist because Yiopoulos was also a writer, playwright, a painter, and he developed his own vision of humanism afterwards, and sometimes he's credited for the word, which is not correct, because Audiberti invented it in a text in 46 called Guéridon Argument, which means little tables, human little tables. And so, in this book, the story is about an ancient soldier who comes back from the war, First World War, and just kills in an act of totally gratuitous violence the children, Italian children, playing on a merry-go-round. And there is a reflection on this kind of really absolutely meaningless violence that the war was, and what happens if you push it to the end. So it's a pretty violent and very cruel book on how the war was perceived. And in Italy there was the specifics, so he talks about this soldier who was taken from the south, who didn't really understand why he was going to war, and so this is what Yiopoulos explains. And so this is how Audiberti came to the senses, to the definition of humanism, saying that finally all the humanist civilization is responsible for this war, and the First World War already was the sign of the crush and the fall of this civilization, or at least its ineptity, its total powerless. It can become totally powerless. And so here you have a definition of humanism, so it's on the top, page 45. What is humanism? It is the world without man and without the human as we know it. And there is a whole development in different chapters in which they explain that finally the economy of the universe, there's no reason that the economy of the universe is submitted to human investigations. And there is a revulsion, of course, of the hierarchies, so very deeply anthropocentrist. And there is also a kind of a reflection on the species hierarchies, archaic, inferior, so why this, why not this, so why do we imagine that we're more complex than these? And what did we do with the world that was given to us, supposedly? So there's even some kind of eco-ontology in Audiberti and specifically Brienne's work, as we are going to see, a reflection on that. There is also a sense, something that was present already in Marie Dubois, that you can find in this pretty funny passage where Brienne recounts the story of how he went at home and then he found another Brienne sleeping with his wife, and then there was another Brienne. He got out of his body and then he watched the other Brienne, and then finally there was a third Brienne, but actually this third Brienne was Marat, so the famous Marat. And so a lot of ironic references to French history in particular, history in general, with references to the war a lot as at the moment of massacre that was decisive. And so this is L'Ouvre-Boîte comes in 52, and in 55 Audiberti came back with another book called La Humanisme, which is kind of a philosophical treatise that was published. It's less, it's still very ironic. It's less dynamic, so L'Ouvre-Boîte, it's a real flow of words. It's almost automatic. So what we know from the way it was conceived, there was a dactylo kind of noting everything that Brienne and Audiberti was doing, and from what I could see in the archives at one point, I think they diverged. It's not very clear. I also asked Audiberti's daughter how it went, and at one point in the archives of Audiberti, you find a lot of notes of Brienne, please come to the cafe, come and have a drink with me, you know, and Audiberti apparently doesn't answer because certain notes, he says, okay, we haven't seen you for a while. So he was very, Audiberti was pretty, a person who had, how to say that, a very angry character sometimes, and so could be very explosive. And so this is why he cut a relationship with Joppolo, with Brienne, which probably also contributed to the fact that Abhumanism at one point disappeared as well as a trend in the thought of post-war Paris. Also, there's the case that the people who study Audiberti mainly study him for his theater, that's the most famous thing, and so the Abhumanism was qualified as a kind of a tentative of his to resemble other intellectuals like Sartre, who was were writing philosophy at the time, and the most important people who work on Audiberti actually dismissed Abhumanism as something not very important. And so here too, what do we have? So what is Abhumanism? A sentence that looks very much like Breton's third manifesto, c'est l'homme acceptant de perdre de vue qu'il est le centre de l'univers. This is man accepting to lose sight of his superiority. So it's, the idea is that we will still suffer, he says, but if we diminish this sense of superiority, there will be less frustration. This is what he basically develops. He goes back to the war here a lot, explaining that the war is the achievement of progress, rationality, that if you consider, so he considers war like the absolute achievement if you continue following the logics of humanism as a historical construct again. And so, and defines here also these main things. So multiplicity of the self, kind of finishing, breaking with the integrity of identity, breaking this in order to liberate frustration, liberate desire. Again, this idea comes very often here too. Well, also just say and state at one point that we have to reinvent the paradigm. It's not sufficient. If we continue like this, there will be a third war, according to him. And so his paintings and drawings are secondary in his production. They were not, he had 2 exhibits through his lifetime, so he painted a lot. Painting for him is really important as an Abhumanist statement, he says, because this is there is no one definition of painting for him, so that this multiplicity is something that seems to him a solution. So painting is a solution. Some kind of painting can be Abhumanist, and it can bring over the Abhumanist hypothesis. And so he painted a lot, so he drew a lot. According to his daughter, he was pretty much invested into that. And what you find, so these are all things that you find in the archive, so in the IMEC. So there are inks and gouaches, there are drawings of that kind as well. There are also notebooks that are fully covered with drawings. And there's absolutely nothing on that in terms of research. And I find myself, and here these are hypotheses again, well, this was found in the Ap Humanist, so this is related to the writing of l'Humanisme, so they're very much related to his reflection on Ap Humanism. But this one very much makes me think of Marie Dubois, who at one point becomes also the earth. So he goes to her grave, and then he connects to the forces of the universe as well. So here you have these bodies, this kind of fleshy, the bugs here that could be also interpreted as different things, plants, vegetables. Vegetation, and here you have these very phallic forms that appear here and there, with this man that holds animals, phallic animals, so quite biomorphic, very close to surrealism, or the fish here with the ship on the other side. So that also remind me of his reflection on male desire and the ridiculousness, according to him, of of his own penis and in general the male pretensions as well. So there are also these drawings in which you have figures caught into immanent networks in which you have this kind of circulation of energies. So this very much resembles himself. He did kind of self-portraits here and there. He appears, the figure, he was pretty corpulent at one point, so then the picture you saw here, he's sick at the end of his life. But you have these also bird-like figures that appear a lot. So metamorphosis, transformation is very present in the iconography, as you have here with this woman and this animal that are somehow very much related, and you don't make the difference between them. So these are small notebooks that he fulfilled with drawings, and these women very often appear with wings, so they are like angels, demons, you don't know exactly. They appear in different ways, so here too. The woman bird appears very often, and there are references to this woman bird appears in one of his books called Carnage, that was written also during World War II, and that talks about a woman who is almost like a frog, and has a kind of a bird default on her fingers, and so she lives in the water, so she's like a little bit like a mythical being. This was written when he was living in the north, in the Jura, and and at the end she appears, so she's in connection with the bird. So there is really a sense of destruction also of nature. There is something ecological about the thought of Aldiberti, and specifically in this book called Carnage, and in these figures that appear. And so here too you have this very strange animal, and he had these large lips as well, Aldiberti, and it's this nose, so it could be him as well here too. And so sometimes he wrote in different books. So here it's Lana. He wrote a lot. There are a lot of books that he wrote. He was very prolific. And in Lana, so he explained the fact that he was drawing these composite animals, these gonzesses erronées, so it's, how to say gonzesse, I don't know how to translate that, but you can probably understand, with wings. So the Asian demons and sirène moustachue. So it's also it's Bernard d'Epervier, it's, you know, the cue of the hawk. This kind of mix here. So he was himself sometimes. He sometimes himself explains what he draws. So here the same citation comes here, and then in Opéra du Monde, he also comes to these composite winged females combined with birds. So here another example in the notebooks. So with the fish, the kind of winged women. So with the variable geometry of, as he says, of the women's legs. And so here they appear more threatening. And so here too there is this male figure that's maybe Audiberti himself. Sometimes you have this clumsy, almost primitive men that are covered with hair as well, that appear very often in his drawings. So it's not, it's drawings that are not forcibly meant to be shown. Again, he had an ambiguous attitude towards that. He wanted to show the works because he did show them 2 times. He had a certain attachment to his own work, but of course it's not it's not masterpieces in the sense. It's really little pieces here and there. You can find him. He also drew on, like many people in Paris at the time, on the napkins. There are napkins in the archives as well. So it was this kind of expression that he was looking for, that was automatic and in the same time liberating for him. And together with Brienne, they wrote L'Oeuvre Boîte, and Brienne's painting was for Audiberti something essential. And so to him, even L'Oeuvre Boîte was triggered by the necessity to comment on the works of Brienne. They were very good friends, so Camille Brienne was somebody who very popular. He was very funny, he was very witty. So he circulated in Paris. He was from Nantes, so he came to Paris again, like Audiberti, somewhere in the 20s. We don't know exactly. And he was related to the surrealist circles there. We know that because he, for instance, exhibited with Erik Olsen, who was a Swedish painter related to the surrealists. And so he, as you can see, even though the quality is not very good, I just wanted to put it in the right side here, this work. There are works reminding of the Cadavre Exquis. There are works that are very automatic, also with these hybrid figures. There are these kind of works as well in Brienne later, in which you have more of a biomorphism, more of a kind of mixes of the different kingdoms, the clear definition of what is represented. It could be a heart, it could be a rock. So here with L'Oeuvre Boîte and the reflection on painting, and this is related to what I was saying about how Audiberti reflected on the place of his own visual works, is that there is also a consciousness of the functioning of the art world, and that is common for Brienne, for Audiberti and Valls, that they want to escape the reflecting on the historical, again, avant-garde, and how the galleries would capture that. And so here in this sentence, Audiberti actually gives a sense of that. He states the possibility that one man has to insert in a valid way in the sociological chain that goes to the merchants of color, to the directors of galleries, all these works by Brienne that actually seem to be painted by Anemone and Ants and Langoustine. So it's this idea of escaping, through that escaping, which is a dystopian-utopian thing. They're very dystopian. They don't believe it could happen in the same time, so they always have this kind of ironic distance constantly that prevents them in the same time from falling into that structure, and has, of course, drawn criticism to their work and their reflection. So here's another work by Brienne that probably you have seen. It's close to Dada surrealism. It's, by the way, it comes together with the book L'Aventure des Objets that he wrote with it's at the end. Okay, I'll show you the book. When we talk about surrealism, with Raoul Michelet Hubac, that he worked, who was related to the surrealists. And there is, it's called The Press in the Forest, and it came out of a dream, and it came out also of a text that is in the archives of Audiberti in the IMEC, and poem, it's a poem called Anti-Daphne, and there is a note related to this poem. And so he tells a story of an encounter with a woman without great future, but actually it was a great encounter. And so at one point, the name of the woman was engraved on a tree, and then the woman was gone, and she came back, and she took a picture of her in the forest. And so here came the idea to relate the tree, the breast, the woman. It also came out of a side of a story that happens in Justine, where there is a whole scene of an orgy that happens in the forest. So here too, the inanimate, the kingdoms, the animate, all this goes together in a dreamlike vision of desire. And again, going back to some kind of a fusion with nature that absorbs the human and diminishes the human. So that appears also in Brienne's paintings and his poems as well. So he wrote a lot. So he was a poet painter who claimed, so he had a lot of exhibits. He was definitely integrated into the visual arts and literature as well. He published this little poem, Je Penche. It's a small book like this. And then it was, of course, republished many times. And it's Je Penche, of course, fuses the two verbs, je pense and je peins. You have here the idea of going back again to something abhuman, going back to insects and imagining what insects would paint, again with the distance of irony, because, well, you reject humanism, right? So if you imagine that insects paint like this, you can fall into the trap of humanism. So they play constantly and go in circles around those topics. And so here there is also the sense of prehistory as well. So prehistory comes very often with Brienne. So tu offres, je caverne, so it's of course an invented verb. It comes from caverne, the cave, and tu offres, the ochre being one of the pigments used in prehistory. And also je poile des pierres. Here is an important verb. So here it comes from a text that Audiberti wrote on the work of Brienne. It's called Camille Brienne, poileur de pierre, which poileur is like polir des pierres. So there is again this kind of pun. There are a lot of puns in their language. So poiler des pierres, but of course it turns, when you polir des pierres, so when you nap the flintstone, you obtain something useful, tools or things like this, or hard. So here poileur de pierre, of course, poil as well is the pan. So poêler des pierres doesn't make sense because you don't eat them, but here too you have this circulation between the different the different kingdoms and the different types of natural substances that go around and constantly in metamorphosis. So here a painting like Telluri, for instance, in 52. So he started painting before he rather drew, and so published these kind of pictures with objects that are very much reminiscent of the objects of symbolic function of surrealism. So he became part of, not the School of Paris, because he's not mentioned in, and it's justified that he's not mentioned in there, because the School of Paris was very much in the idea of restoring this sort of vision of humanism and humanist France, and humanism that through art would save the world. Brienne and Audiberti were kind of totally against that vision in France that is associated to what we call the Trente Glorieuses, a certain vision. So they were against, they were rather you have to go to the bottom of that and rejected. So he's a little bit apart. It's difficult to classify him. He's sometimes mentioned as a tachist painter. It's true that he knew Michel Tapier, the person who invented the term tachism. Informel, sorry, not tachism, informel. Tachism was with Charles Estienne. So he's sometimes mentioned here and there, but nobody knows exactly how to classify Brienne's work. So at the end, probably because of that too, his work was a little bit forgotten in all that. And it's one of the artists who has received the less critical attention, strangely enough, whereas he was really, really a figure in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So here, this work also is called Epéril, and again, to the circulation of things goes, circulation of different media as well. So this is the manuscript of Epéril, that is also a poem. So what is Epéril? Epéril, nobody knows what is Epéril. It's maybe an insect, it's maybe, but it's a phonetic poem. So he was also very close friend with Ilias, and so he took also this. And by the way, this poem Epéril was then broken into pieces. So there is one version of Epéril éclaté that he did with the future neorealist, with Raymond Hans. There is a lot of circulation activity. So he was an abstract painter, so usually he goes to the abstract part of the story of the post-war Paris, but he was also very much related with other people that were circulating, the letters, for instance, as well, that he knew. So, and the third person that could be associated with this vision that goes shuttering, the identities, but also very deeply anthropocentric vision is, of course, Volz's vision. So Volz was a very good friend of Brienne. So in Louvre-Bois, he's mentioned, page 119, by Brienne as somebody who was not interested in the human. So he was completely separated from the human, according to Brienne. So going after the rhythm of life, he was a machine plant rather than a citizen, and a kind of an up-human for Brienne. And another person that's interesting when we read Georges Mathieu, so who was an abstract painter in the post-war Paris, in his book, when he tells the story of the Parisian post-war abstraction, désormais seul en face de Dieu, he wrote that Volz would be associated with abhumanism, even though he kind of didn't forcibly agree with that, but however he admitted then his friendship with Brienne was very probably affected his reflection on that. With Artaud and Art that he's citing in the same place. So Volz's vision of it's really specifically in his archives, again here, what could be found in the Centre Pompidou. So this comes from the Bibliothèque Kandinsky. His archives were unfortunately dispersed 10 years ago. The archives that were with his wife. Of course, there is a lot of stories about the wives of artists and all that. So here too, there is one. But what we know about these archives and at Kandinsky, they come from Ilias. So Volz was also a friend with Ilias, and apparently, according to some people, he gave them to Ilias in order to save them from what was going to his wife, to Bretigol's. But well, that's a different story. So this is what we have. So here we have also a drawing writings and a lot of drawings. So Volz is known as a visual artist. He's known for his aphorisms. He was preparing a book, so he was very much working on that. So this is what we have here, a manuscript that he was preparing in Dieu-le-Fils, so in the south of France, when he was hiding. So he got out of the camp. He was first imprisoned in the Camp des Milles because he was German. Then he married Rétivos, and he could get out, but he was still suspicious for everybody. So he had to spend some time at Dieu-le-Fils, pretty much isolated, where he very probably, definitely, somewhere in alcoholism. And So he wrote this kind of, so this is, you know, very different. This is pretty chaotic. So it's, he too, like Audiberti, was writing wherever he could. So there are different envelopes of that kind, but this one I like it particularly because there is this kind of aphorism, these kind of thoughts that go against the great discourses, something that humanism is, and that Audiberti and Briand also cast into question, so something that puts them closer to post-structuralism and postmodernism in their reflection. So when he says here that before talking to the students of the public dangers like tuberculosis, syphilis, and plague, you should attract their attention, draw their attention to the dangers, bigger dangers like the big achievements, the ambitions, the politics, and then it's not readable what follows in here. So here also there are these reflections that are very anthropocentric, anti-anthropocentric, in which he says here, for example, je suis une, I don't see it here, but genre histoire naturelle, mon activité ne me semble pas humaine, so my activity doesn't seem human to me, so it's recurring in his drawings, in his writings, and in the little papers that he is making. So this idea, so he also very much was fascinated with insects, and there is a reflection, so very often, of course, this circus ball comes from the Candémie, when there were insects and they were not very pleasant for sure, and they were described by Wolfgang here, they were described by a lot of people who were imprisoned there. But for Volstead, it had a different meaning, and in here, I have published a lot on that, and there are also publications coming now on his relation also with Frobenius, because he was very much related to anthropology. His family knew Frobenius, and he was trained in the observation of the insects and other cultures. And he put the flea actually as the central hero character and actor of his circus balls, and it appears all the time. So here it is enlarged. It's a very complex thing, the circus ball. There is machinery everywhere. There's some kind of scope, proper scope, kind of a machine that enlarges the animals, and then, well, these little insects, and then projects them 3D in the middle of the arena. And Volz explains that very clearly in the archive. So you have a whole explanation about what he wants to do, so a kind of a revision of all the heritage of humanist culture with the big names in thought, with the big philosophers, with Nietzsche, Freud, or mentioned in all that. And in the same time, it's a circus, so it goes to the popular arts, and it's a show. And in the same time, it's a kind of a show that wants to go against the blingy and rather shiny vision of humanity. So he puts the fleas and other animals and insects in the middle. And there's, of course, a kind of a sleepy feeling. So some of the drawings resemble eyes, as if he was dreaming in night or entering a kind of a dream world, because, of course, this all happens at the time when he is in prison. Also, there are his photographs that are today studied from a different light, and there is a really interesting work going on them with this, the relation with the object, with the fragmentation. He was also related to the Surrealists, and it's interesting, indirectly, he didn't take part, but he was related to them in the sense that his wife already was married to a Surrealist, that he had pictures, I'll show you later. He took pictures of some Surrealists, and he rather, well, if we consider his relationship and acquaintances, he was rather on the side of the dissidents around Bataille. So, of course, you can probably, if you know Document, you can see some common points as well with Elie Lyotard or Boifard as well. So that it's not very clear to trace actually his relations with the Surrealists, but it goes rather on that side, rather than to the group with Breton, even though he knew Max Derricks as well. And so his works of famous paintings, so this one in Pompidou, are also going around the idea of the metamorphosis of different species and mix of fossilized insects, plants, and invention of new forms of life and reinterpretation of all that. So he started painting after pretty late, before a few years before he died, and according to his own words and some witnesses, he was not that happy with paintings, even though his paintings are like this and it's not very, very big. But he preferred these very small because the watercolors are really small formats that he apparently preferred. And so to go towards a reflection, so it's really interesting to consider, of course, a movement like humanism with all the defaults, of course, that critically with the distance we can discover, but it's part of those multiplicity of very shattered movements and trends in the thought that you had in post-war Paris, and that probably made that a great discourse was not made about French art, and you know that the official art history, even though we're casting that into question, and there is a lot of research going on that, still goes on the side of American art with the idea that nothing was happening in Paris. A lot of things were happening, but people were very separated. And there was a recent book also that was published by Giraud, so who is himself an artist and was part of around surrealism, and who gives, by the way, Michel Giraud is among the first who wrote a book on Audiberti, and he considered Audiberti and Brienne in great esteem, and he still does. And he has drawings of Audiberti. Sometimes they appear, you know, they're sold something like, I don't know, 25 euros or 30 euros on Drouot, and according to Audiberti's daughter, it's Michel Giraud's collection. And so he wrote this book and explaining how there were these people quarreling, so which is the case of Audiberti, and who are, of course, in a sort of a depression because things happened in France, because the Holocaust happened in France, because they witnessed and they had to somehow find a way. And for Audiberti, there was criticism coming from the left on what he did during the war, and what he did during the war was not bad in general, but he kind of continued writing for some newspapers, just exhibit reviews or film reviews, but it was under the occupation, so very often this was reproached to him, but of course he had a family, of course he had 2 daughters, one of his daughters were sick, so he never really baptized with the occupation, but he continued just working. He found his way, and this is also a criticism, by the way, often still addressed to the surrealists by certain other artists, and by the communists in particular. So it's one of those movements that appear, that are minority, that are very shattered, that are sometimes incredibly radical in their thought. And I chose to talk about surrealism because there is, of course, evidently some relations. The idea of transformation, metamorphosis, and biomorphism is recurring. Marie Dubois, that I mentioned in the beginning, could be compared to some kind of Nadja, so going on the traces of a woman, so in this case who's dead, and there are comparisons of that kind in the literature on Audiberti and his writings. The idea of the multiplicity of the self, so the self and the integral self, the rational self, that's in the body, it explodes, and this is the way to cut frustration and to find a new form of emancipation, because that's the point, right? Our humanism needs, I wouldn't say a new humanism, we say that for surrealism, but I won't go against their very harsh criticism of humanism to say it's a new form of humanism, but it's of course, they're looking for a way to emancipate in this context that after the wars that was very hard for them. The fragmentation and dissolution goes with the multiplicity of the self, something that could be incredibly, of course, painful. And on that side, Antonin Artaud on whom Audiberti wrote, and he was in the Artaud committee, so helping Artaud with Breton together, and he assisted, he attended with his daughter the conference at the Vieux Colombier, that is very famous, of course. So, exploration of the body, the flesh, desire, the object, this is also important, also this idea of going to a certain bottom with the exploration of the body, where the body can go. So he wrote a lot about illness as well. So the hasard objectif that Breton named like this, so the idea of original encounters, of kind of encounters that are the fruit of chance, so this importance of chance. The critical reflection of anthropocentrism is very prominent. The distrust of positivism, progress, rationality, and more concretely the acquaintances, the venues in common, so the publishers, the references, Sade, Lautréamont are recurring here too. And it's difficult again in terms of facts. Bernard Fournier, who wrote recently a biography, the first biography that has appeared really serious, factual biography on Audiberti, didn't find any link between, any correspondence between Audiberti and Breton. According to Marie-Louise Audiberti, her father was a little bit of distance, so there was a kind of an admiration and maybe even a little bit of envy for the role that Breton played. And he didn't want to go there, he wanted to launch his own school, so he was kind of shaken between this ambition, that's probably the proper of that time, the ambition of doing that, but not to pactize with any kind of systems, existing systems, to avoid all kind of exploitation from the system, but of course he was dependent on publishers, and he knew that. So, he published at Gallimard, Breton did as well. He worked with Benjamin Perret. He was pretty, so this is here, there's work to be done. I haven't found anything in particular, but I'm continuing. And he was very close with Benjamin Perret in the 20s, and it's Benjamin Perret who actually found his job at the Petit Parisien, and they worked there together. And it's interesting because Perret has a similar thought with Histoire Naturelle that comes after, during his exile, during World War II. So there's something to be done here, more research to be done on that point. But there is this relation. So they also knew the same people, they admired Apollinaire, both of them, and there is this idea of automatic writing, so very Baroque automatic writing for Audiberti, usually qualified as Baroque, quite a lot of musicality, a mix of rawness and poetry, goes to the abject and then goes in the sky, so that's kind of a very spiritual at the same time reflection. In terms of what is interesting is, of course, that after the war, Breton also comes with a sentence that is in the Prolegomena that is pretty close to what Audiberti did. Of course, Breton is first, so I must say that. In the Prolegomena, he says, "L'homme n'est peut-être pas le centre, le point de mire de l'univers." So this is a text in English, so I heard it in English. This was published in New York. The VVV, man is perhaps not the center, the focus of the universe. One may go so far as to believe that there exists above him on the animal level beings whose behavior is alien to him as his own must be to the day fly or the whale. And so here again this horizontal vision of the species comes with Breton, who, as you know in the Prolegomena, comes with the utopia of the grand transparent, the large transparency, a new myth, new foundation myth that he was longing for humanity. And so another point that I find really interesting is the recurrence of World War I and World War II in a very indirect way. So never you will have an analysis that's based on historical facts, but there is the statement that this was something paramount, fundamental, that cut, really severed the relation of them as young men, or in the case of Audiberti as a child, with the civilization, so with the humanist civilization, and that something had to be rethought. And so here, so you know better probably the interviews that Breton gave to Parisot where he qualified the First World War as a cloaque de sang, sottise debout, and then he explained that it was, sorry, it's very sensible. So he explained that these big discourses led a lot of, at the end, a lot of young men to sacrifice themselves in their lives. The same thing Audiberti here in this tapestry that was unpublished, but it's actually published in one of the second book that was published on Audiberti by André Deslandes. There was so Giraud et Deslandes that published really the first overviews, not exactly factual biographies, but overviews of his art in the 60s, when he just after he died. And so he explains here that what he learned at school was about, you know, the traditional culture, but all this didn't make sense after the war for him, and so there was a rupture that had to be recognized. And so, well, Walsh and Man Ray, just to give you a sense that, of course, there were relations. And of course, Walsh was very much imbued by surrealist photography. He observed that he wanted to become a photographer, by the way. Well, he knew Masseners, obviously, and he made several portraits of him before they went together to the Condamine. And again, here, their relationship is not documented in terms of archives. But we have the pictures. And for Brienne and Raoul Michelet, so Raoul Hubach, who worked under the pseudonym of Raoul Michelet, of course, in L'Actuation Poétique or the other book that I showed, L'Aventure des Objets, The Adventure of Objects, in both books, there is clearly a surrealist atmosphere, like in this photograph here, that very much reminds of Deleuze. And so there is a certain sort of continuation of the radicality of a radical thought, of a reflection, well, connections with the avant-garde that stems clearly from a rejection of humanism that Dada and Surrealism had in the interwar period. So Dada very, very clearly, through the writings of art or through artworks, cast into question the humanist civilization. This is what Surrealism did as well, with the idea of non-existence of oneself and non-control of humans, of themselves and the universe, using Freud and other authors. And it's of course interesting to go back to this history. So there was research done recently on Lettrism, for instance, really in depth, because the archives of Izou were also pretty much untouched until 10 years ago. So ecumenism is part of that same phenomenon. That my sense is that it has to be studied and not, you know, put aside under the pretext that it's not serious. There is a reflection on what was happening, on the war, on the world, on the role of art. There is a very much dystopian, probably radical dystopian attitude that, you know, it's all vain and it's like an insect, so you paint like an insect because, you know, it's like an insect you passed and this is what you can do. So there is not a sense of great ideas and great achievement and better humanity. So how you construct a community around that, it's definitely more dystopian than most of the visions of the historical avant-garde, but however it continues topics that are present here. And Brienne was pretty aware of that, so I'll finish on this sentence that comes from an interview that he gave from France Culture just before he died in 1976, in which he explained that it was very curious that movements like structuralism were launched a few years after ecumenism, and he was very surprised himself because he had thought about these things, but the discretion that he had in this field and the fact that he was not a specialist in philosophy made him silent, reticent to talk about this. But he acknowledged that something was happening. There was thought afterwards, like structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, that were talking about these things. And it's true that ecumenism is never acknowledged. And sometimes even I can say that even the avant-garde is not acknowledged in some of the discourses that came afterwards. And so, but there's something to certainly to be done in the gap. Okay, thank you. So I think that